an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
We've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas.
Yes, that will be the subject of today's edition of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Welcome in, Dave Trafford here, along with Keith Leslie. You see and hear him on CH Television out of Hamilton, and we'll get into some of the festivities that went on this past weekend in Hamilton. And John Wright is here from Maru Public Opinion. And Sabrina Nanji unable to join us today, so we'll get into the whys and wherefores of that when she comes back to join us, hoping that she's back in her chair next week. So welcome in. Lots to talk about. And earlier in the week, I had a chance to catch up with Kathleen Wynne after the AGM, the Liberal AGM in Hamilton last weekend, and just put it to her in terms of the thought that now the party has decided that they are going to have the weighted one member, one vote model in terms of selecting the new leader. And I just put it to her, was that her vote? She asked whether or not she had to reveal that, but clearly it was not her vote. She would prefer the delegated convention.
I'm really a fan of the people making the decision being people who are committed to the party, and who are really deeply invested in the party and in the delegated convention process. As you guys have talked about, there's a pretty robust on the ground riding association process to choose those delegates. All those features we're going to have to find a way, I think, to build into this new process. But on the weekend, it was very clear to me that the younger people in the room, the next generation, were really committed to this, and so they will make it work. I know they will. I have a lot of confidence in them. One of the things I loved about the AGM this past weekend was that there were so many young people in the room, so many young people who want to see the party rise up again, who are committed to the work that we have already done and committed to how we can work going forward. So I'm confident in them. It's hard, change is hard, and when you've been part of something that you're committed to, there are anxieties, but we'll forge on.
The former premier making it clear, Keith, that if they had had a weighted one member, one vote approach back in 2013, she never would have been the leader of the party.
No,
she would not. She thought won that. She would have,
Sandra Pupatello probably would have won
for sure.
Particular race under that system. I think it's a little bit ironic that Sabrina's not here today because. I think she expressed not only surprise last week that the three of us were all in favor of the delegated style of convention. She didn't quite state it, but there was clearly disappointment in her voice with us.
That's right. What's wrong with you?
And I think
it's democracy.
I think Kathleen Wynne nailed it there, as she often does. It's a generational thing for sure. Not just those of us that experience delegated conventions, but for the same reasons that wins it. We think that the local riding association people who are there year in, year out are the important people. And they're the ones that know the party and are loyal to it and should be the ones selecting the leader. But it's clearly a generational thing. Democracy won, and we all knew it going in. We knew Sabrina was right that the mood of the room was. The Liberals were going to, they weren't going to be the last party in Canada holding delegated leadership conventions. That just wasn't going to happen. So I think it will change the way things go, but it's fair rules for everyone. I mean, it's the same rules for every candidate. So how that's going to adjust, whether, someone like a Bonnie Crombie decides to come in, whether she would have preferred a delegated convention where she'd have more assured support on the first ballot. I'm not clear on that, how it's going to affect the candidates, who's going to come in the race. I was kind of surprised though that they didn't at least, set a date. I mean, they still haven't decided if they're going to do the leadership election this year or next year. And that's, of course, also going to determine who gets in as a candidate and who decides to stay out.
Yeah, but I think part of that, though, is the notion, and then Wynne alluded to it in our conversation, that, in fact, they're going to have to come up with the structure of this leadership race, and what will that convention look like, and what will the process be? I mean, John Fraser floating this balloon that perhaps we need regional sort of primaries to kind of make sure that there's enough conversation around the issues so that, and maybe even it's the window of the voting and how you actually vote and so on. What does that convention, the decision day look like, so that it's not just binary. Either it's a delegated convention or you just mail in your ballots and hope for the best. Somewhere in between, you need to have that interaction that we've been talking about is so valuable, John. So, they might be smart to get that process right first, as opposed to it just being, the model that everybody else is using, which is, I guess it's engaging, but it's like doing a Facebook poll. I mean, to decide whether or not people like stuff. In your world, that just wouldn't fly.
Well, and I stand by everything I said last week for a couple of reasons. But I do like the idea of exploring somewhere in the middle. I don't know how that works. I'm not an expert in these things, but I think there's a way in which you can have some kind of a convention and at the same time do something that's local. Look, I don't think it's just because I've gone to conventions and seen it and how it operates that way. I'm against just a few people running a party, but I'm also against somebody who swoops in and buys up lots of memberships and puts people on buses and brings them in, swamps the party, gets their candidate elected, and then vanishes. I mean, it's a short-term kind of thing. You get people who buy memberships and you could say, look, I've got all these people and we get more money for the convention, and then they're gone. And that's it. And we've seen that happen in recent times, and I don't think that benefits the party. At the end of the day, you want people who work the riding, know the ridings, are part of the riding. So that's where I'm on that side of the fence. But I do see that there's an opportunity to do something that's somewhere in between. And secondly, I do understand the intergenerational piece. I also understand that oftentimes you want to cut against the grain when you're young. You have this idea that democracy is everything, so let's open it up to everybody and all that sort of stuff. And again, I was probably doing the same thing when I was a parliamentary intern, thinking in these thoughts as well. But it's different nowadays, and you can have parties hijacked. You can have things done in a way in which is, as I said, more of a temporary member of the party, and you get some short-term benefits. But I'm not sure whether or not long-term it really helps you out.
Populists love it. Populists love the one member, one vote.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree with you. And I think what Dave said is that maybe there's a hybrid. Maybe there's something in between that allows you to do something that's a little bit different. But I mean, I remember very clearly there's importance to the drama, and I was there that night as well when Kathleen Wynne won. And what struck me that night was that while Sandra Pupatello was marvelous on the hustings, her speech that night was tone deaf. Like that's what ruined it for her. Kathleen Wynne was completely the opposite. I mean, she was almost the anti-politician, and Sandra Pupatello came on stage and strutted and delivered a performance, and the room went, that's an act. I don't want to do that. So, I mean, it all comes down to connecting with the audience there, whereas the other one is kind of all ranked and done, and it's not as intimate, let's put it that way. So anyways, I wish there would be some way to do this that was somewhere in between.
Well, one of the other face plants that I remember at a convention was Bob Rae running for the federal Liberals. He went through his entire speech off the cuff, never spoke one word of French, and he was in Montreal and he was hoping to lead the federal Liberals. So, there are moments that happen that change. All of a sudden, you present yourself as you are, so to speak, that has an impact on, okay, I understand you better now, rather than just an email blast that comes out. And maybe if I'm motivated enough, I go to a town hall meeting.
I would also say that a delegated convention has lots of schisms that you see. And it does happen where there's a rift afterwards and that the party isn't healed. But you gotta say that there's all these people in one place, and you try to bring that group of people together so that there's actually some kind of momentum going forward where you're all kind of joined. I mean, there's the speech that's magnanimous, and all that sort of stuff. I think back to the oldest days, people wouldn't remember, but except some of us on the podcast here. But I mean, when Frank Miller won, and then Pat Kinsella and that group, holed up in the Four Seasons Hotel, it split the party to bejesus, and ended up losing them the next election. But on the other hand, there are many other conventions that we saw where somebody won and, even going, and again, I don't want to sound like a dinosaur. I was there as a kid. But if you go back to the Davis convention, Norman Atkins was running Alan Lawrence's campaign, and Davis reached across and brought Atkins in, and because Paul Wheat, I think, was running his. There's a group of people in a room you can work with. You can do certain things to heal the party. But on the other hand, that opens it up for people saying, look, there's lots of backroom deals going on. There's no representation. It's just a bunch of theater that happens. So I get it, but you got to have it both.
But
both
one of the
ways.
distinctions, and you've touched on it, one of the distinctions that Kathleen Wynne made around the delegated versus the one member, one vote is the winner of one member, one vote displays the ability to be a great organizer. It says nothing or very little about their leadership capabilities or how they would lead the party. And, that is not that you can't have or mustn't have good organization in a delegated convention, but it's almost way overly weighted in terms of I've just got a great organization and so I win.
Well, that happens in either one. I think that would happen in either case. I mean, even at a delegated convention, as John was saying, it's a lot of these backroom players, the ones that help run these campaigns, that know who can work with who and whose candidates actually, even though they've been tearing each other apart for a couple of months, actually do have a lot of common ground and can get together. I think that's going to be the same whether it's one member, one vote or a delegated convention. It's the way leadership campaigns are run, and they play to the rules. Remember when it wasn't that long ago when Doug Ford won the PC leadership, and he didn't get to have the balloon drop because the timing went on so long. But where were the other candidates? They all went home before he announced he'd won, except for Tanja Granick-Allen. She was the only one still in the room with him. That, to me, let so much of the air out of the party right there, right then. And that's something for, if we weren't all there, we wouldn't have all seen that. That's if it's one member, one vote and some announcement of a result, it's not the same. It's not the same. And I think that was a truly dramatic moment in Ontario politics. And we saw someone who had zero experience at Queen's Park become the PC leader. And we knew the PC leader was going to become the next premier. And sure enough, that's what we got.
But there were two things on the weekend that really struck me. First of all, terrible snowstorm. And yet everybody shows up. I mean, there's an enthusiasm in the Liberal Party to bring it back from the dead and to move on. No tribute to Del Duca. Let's just, let's get going here. And then, of course, on that evening, Bonnie Crombie shows up dressed in red, is ushered in. There's a buzz in the room. Everybody, and then leaves the room. But those were the two things that you take away from this convention, aside from the organizational piece. I mean, that was the buzz. It was, we're back. We're 28% in the polls, but we can still do some things, blah, blah, blah. On the Bonnie Crombie side, it's very interesting. Yeah, Keith, you said they haven't decided on when they're going to have the convention. Well, they want to put it off probably to let her do her thing in Mississauga. I mean, she's very clear on the podium recently saying she still has lots to do, and there is. But give her some space to get these things done. But the question I raised last time, I'll raise again this time, and that is, will she run if there's a risk that she's not going to win? And again, this is a very different structure. And on the one hand, you could, as an organizer, bring in a lot of people to the party who would remain loyal because she would appear to be somebody who you want to lead. On the other hand, maybe it's going to produce a more divisive circumstance and it may not work out that way. But it'll be interesting to see how much role she plays in this in making herself the leader of the party.
Well, not that she was making an endorsement or anything, but quietly, or not quietly, quite explicitly observing the qualities of leadership that Bonnie Crombie has. Kathleen Wynne thinking she would not only be a great leader for the party, but a great premier of the province. But again, she's not endorsing anybody.
Well,
so just for those of you listening, I'm going to take the interview I had with Kathleen Wynne. I'm going to drop it into the On the Ledge feed along with this, so you can have a listen to that rather wide-ranging discussion I had with her earlier in the week. Last week we got off on talking about the Liberals and their convention and didn't get to the healthcare. This story's not going away, particularly because we had the FAO this week, Keith, talking about how underfunded the healthcare system is for all the money that we spend, looking at something like $45 billion over a couple of years that, we aren't spending or have not yet allocated to our healthcare services. Then you combine that with the story out of the Ottawa Hospital, and a private group of incorporated surgeons has decided that they're going to make good use of surgery operation rooms in the hospital on the weekends. They hire staff, they're all this kind of thing from the hospital. They're actually actively recruiting staff from the hospital to work these extra hours, these extra shifts. Clearly, based on the reporting that the CBC has done, they have found that the money being offered is considerably higher than you would get for the same kind of shift in the hospital Monday to Friday. And all of this against the backdrop of nobody knowing who is actually paying the bill here. I mean, is it coming out of public funds? Is it coming out of your pocket because you get to go to the front of the line? I can't imagine anything worse to happen in this conversation so early on, like days after the provincial government finally decides that private clinics can deliver OHIP services.
I want to go back to the FAO, but let me start by answering your last question first. Yes, the public is paying. Now, back to the FAO. I don't know why Ontario has a financial accountability office and officer, because every time they issue a report such as this one saying, how many billions of dollars shortfall underfunding in healthcare over X number of years, the government just, their assumptions are wrong, their accounting's wrong, we're spending this, we're putting more money into healthcare than anyone's ever put into it before. And the public is just left doing a math test that they don't have any interest in doing. So the FAO just is undermined completely by this government. There were some other telling things in there, as not just the dollar numbers, but other numbers in the FAO report saying how many nurses were short, and that's going to continue for another few years. But even worse, the nursing shortage will get less as it goes on by about the next 3 or 4 years. It will reduce somewhat. The shortage of public support or PSWs is going to, in personal support workers, is going to increase massively, like 3 times what it is already. So there's a lot to take in that FAO's report. And I don't know that the government takes any of it in, because they just instantly and automatically, even before he comes out, they're dismissing his reports. His assumptions are always wrong. And we'll prove we're spending more than anyone else on healthcare. We've invested this, that, and the other, and we're opening more long-term care beds. We're addressing all these shortages. There's real disparity. There's a lot of disagreement between what the FAO says and the government says, but I don't know how the public or anyone else is really supposed to support out who's doing what. Other than at the end of the year, look at the government's, the budget and the actual tables of spending and see what's there. And they do spend more than was spent before, but are they underspending? They certainly are if we're going to meet the current commitments that are needed. The other part of your question was, of course, this new private orthopedic surgical clinic being set up on weekends at the Riverside campus of the Ottawa Hospital. And this is because those facilities, public paid for, public built, public run, are not used on weekends because there's not public funding to run them on weekends. So this group of doctors has gotten together and they decided they can use that surgical time themselves and charge people for it. OHIP will cover this, paying more than they would do during the week. And these, of course, as Dave pointed out, are drawing staff from already exhausted nurses and other staff working in the healthcare system, offering them much more money to work in this private clinic on a weekend. It's all of this together. At the same time, the government is passing its Bill 60, which is the one that's going to allow all the different health professions, to come here from anywhere across the country and work in Ontario without going through a whole bunch of procedural hoops. They don't have to rewrite their exams, get qualified by their colleges, all that sort of thing. Well, there's a Schedule 2 in that bill that we're learning more about this week that loosens the definition of a number of healthcare professionals, including surgeons, registered nurses. It's basically deregulating a lot of this before we're privatizing. So who's going to oversee the privatization? Well, the government hasn't been able to tell us who's going to look at these private clinics, who's going to make sure they don't do the things they're not supposed to do. But just before they start doing it, we're going to deregulate this system. It seems to me they're just paving the way for more and more private clinics when there's already, as I say, capacity in the hospitals. They're using the unused surgical rooms. They're already going to use them. Why aren't we paying public dollars to fund the hospitals to pay their staff to run them 7 days a week instead of 5 days a week? I think there's a lot more to this story than that's my simple view of it. But my view of it is it should be, the for-profit takers should not be taking money out of the system, especially using publicly built and publicly paid for facilities.
Yeah, I don't know where this cluster F starts and finishes, John. It's just because when I think on the one hand, you probably have a mood among the public that will say, let's just get this fixed. Let's deal with the backlogs. If we've got capacity in the system, that's great. If we've got clinics that can do it, that's great, but let's just get it fixed.
Well,
but the next question is always, how is this going to work? And to Keith's point, there has never been a competent or a clear answer on any of the accountability questions.
Yeah, but I'd argue that this has been the difficulty for almost every government for the last 20 years. Healthcare is always at the top of the list. The Liberals have had to deal with trying to clear backlogs. What they haven't had to deal with is the shortages that we have now. They haven't had to deal with the retirements. They haven't had to deal with, the exhausted workers. And my God, we could go down a path talking about, well, if you didn't cap the wages, you might have more. And then there's all that sort of stuff. But I'd say two things to your point, Dave. Number one is, man, that sounds like a slogan like, just get her done. Last time I checked, there are people on that waiting list who don't give a crap whether it's a Saturday or costs $750 for someone to come in. They've got surgeries. They want to get them done. So there's the second part of this is a disruption. The Ministry of Health and the LHINs are not exactly open to a lot of transformation. To me, there is about as bad as any major bureaucracy, especially the military, which is all kind of, they all report to somebody else in the line, and we think of them as all being leaders, but they're all risk averse. The first thing out of many bureaucrats' mouths and someone in the military is no, we can't do that. So this government is caught between, we've got all these shortages, we've got all these problems, but we got to move on. So we need disruptors. We need to do things to just move on. There's no hue and cry against what's happening in Ottawa. There might be some, but there's not the public saying, stop this. It's terrible. We're going to end up paying with our credit card. There's not that. So on the one hand, they've got to work within a system that they are being given and inherited. On the other hand, they have to transform. But let me take it the next step. I study demographics. It's a big part of what I do, and I have for many, many years. We're running out of runway. We have 9 years before the healthcare system in this country collapses because we've got boomers who are going to be looking for home care. There's no home care. There's no plan for home care. My goodness gracious, you can wallpaper all over it, but it's, who's running the home care, the beginnings of the home care grassroots kind of, let's put together the people and have a discussion about it, is the OHA. They've had 2 meetings on this. Why is the hospitals driving a debate about or driving some kind of construction towards solving home care problems? So we've got this huge shortage. We've got long-term care shortage. We've got all these sort of things. All of a sudden, we're going to ramp up to a lot of older people in this system, and there's not going to be people to look after them. So you can't do what's always been done. You can't say, well, we're always going to use public money and just do things the way they've been done. We're going to have some innovation, and we're going to have to move forward. And sometimes that just means, just get her done and we'll try this out. Because at the end of the day, there are people who need to have these procedures. There are people who need to go in and make sure that they're looked after. And if they can't be looked after, then they won't care how it's done. But Doug Ford and the provincial government have got it right on one sense, and that is, it may cost us more money, but you're not going to use your credit card. So, yes, you and I can get in all the debates about, I read parts of the report. I'm not going to read the whole thing. And, we're 33,000 nurses short over the next period of time, and the PSWs and all that. You know what happened when I read that? I just put the paper down. What's the point then of all of this? Why are we protecting something that is even right now not going to be fulfilled? It's overwhelming, right? I think we're going to end up having a lot of people in this province who say it may not have been done the way it has in the past, but it's not working the way it has in the past, and we need to get it
But
changed.
if government's going to pay more, government's going to pay more to have this done on weekends in their own public-built facilities and then why not pay that overtime rate to the publicly employed nurses and doctors? Well, I know the doctors are contract, but pay the staff, those emergency or those operating theaters on the weekends before we start putting them out to profit takers. Why not use all that extra money to pay the overtime rate, if that's what it takes, to run those surgical theaters on the weekends before we let private companies come in and run the same darn things and charge that extra money? If it's public money going anyway, why not use it to keep it in the public system? Why let profit takers in?
I don't know. It's kind of like, OHA on line 2. Why not ask them? I mean, we've got theaters that may be like that, but
we know why
they're not operating right that way right now.
Yeah, because they're not funded for it. And we know surgeons are only funded.
They're not. I mean, they have Michael Warner at East York at the Michael Garron Hospital. He was saying that there's an answer to this. The government has already expressed the solution. During COVID, they extended the hours for operating theaters by 2 hours a day, Monday to Friday, no weekends involved. He said if we just kept doing that, there are certain lists that would disappear, backlogs that would disappear in about a year. So, and then we begin to get ahead of the game. Why aren't we doing that? Yes, to Keith's point, we would, extend a shift or recreate shifts to make that overtime or not. And the question was about the doctors. And in his view, there are surgeons who are underemployed, is the phrase that he used. There is time on their calendar to do this extra 2 hours. So there's space in the system right now. There are people in the system who are saying we can do this right now. Why aren't we doing it right now? In fact, we've done it during COVID to help relieve the backlog. So it doesn't seem to me, John, that that's innovation to some degree. Why are we not even addressing that idea, as opposed to, the default is going to a private company using capacity in the hospital and spending a premium to get that job done. I agree we want to get it done. But, the reckoning, as you have always put it, is coming, pal, and we're just going to run out of money. We just don't have the capacity to pay for it all.
Look, and I don't have any of the big answers, and I think that doctors maybe should run for office rather than just sit and talk about a lot of stuff that they see. I mean, I guess what I look at here is I get a little frustrated that we don't have, we always ask for, where's the plan? And it's either one way or the other way, when in fact what you're talking about is absolutely correct. We should be looking at hybrids. But the bottom line in all of this is that there is an intransigent healthcare system. It's really tough to fight it. And I know that every politician of every stripe that's gone in there, including Bob Ray, has tried to move it along, and it's almost impossible to do so. And you guys are, been around the halls of Queen's Park, and you've heard this for years and years and years. I don't know what the solution is, but I come back to my main point, and that is the politics of this. And the politics of it is that people want movement. They want it done. It's, you don't hear the protests against it. You don't. I mean, you may have the NDP standing up day after day and hammering away on this stuff, but the rest of the public is kind of like, maybe they're just weary, or maybe there's a whole bunch of people saying, yeah, I just need to get this done. Let's just go ahead and do it. Honestly, I think there's more of that in the politic of it than it is anything else.
Just a couple of things before we go. Lots of conversation, of course, in this part of the world about who will be the next mayor of the city of Toronto. There are all kinds of names that are floating to the surface. Anna Bailau, former city councillor, Josh Matlow, finally came up from the gopher hole this week and said, oh yeah, over here, I'm thinking of it too. Thought it was interesting to see in one of the editions of the Queen's Park Observer from Sabrina Nanji this week that apparently the former chief of staff for the premier, Dean French, has been pumping the tires for Mark Saunders, the former Toronto police chief, as the city's next mayor. Now, there's some who are saying, it wasn't all that eventful, but nonetheless, there seems to be a movement at Queen's Park put their thumb on the scale for a guy like Saunders, Keith. And, you know, the Premier, based on Sabrina's reporting here, his quote was, "Let's see if he's going to announce. I think the world of a lot of the candidates, but Chief Saunders did a great job as police chief, and if he goes, that's good. I think that's great, et cetera, et cetera." I mean, there's a lot in there. But,
Well,
clearly a fan of Mark Saunders.
despite the fact that Dean French was pretty much driven out of the Premier's office and away from Queen's Park after the first year there, as the Ford government reset and tried to actually start governing, he appears to have some sort of connection with police forces. I remember they called him in Ottawa to help with the Freedom Convoy at some point. Why on earth he was in? That was the biggest shock of the Freedom Convoy, that he was somehow involved in trying to deal with that situation. But to have him taking Mark Saunders around, as you say, it's a clear sign that the thumb is on the scale. Queen's Park wants a Conservative candidate. Mark Saunders was a Conservative candidate after he was police chief. He did not win, but could he win as mayor? He's certainly a good-looking candidate from the Wright's perspective, and they are worried about a Josh Matlow or you know, some lefty coming in, as the Premier would say. They want to keep someone on the center-right at Toronto City Hall. So this is a very clear signal, I think, from the Premier's office that they would like to see Mark Saunders as the candidate, and he's sort of a favored one. Not a surprise, but again, the field is still wide open, as they say, and so we'll have to see what happens there. I think Saunders would be wise to give it a shot, and I think he could be. You know, I haven't seen any other Conservative standard bearer come forward just yet. So that's my read on Toronto politics at this point, but I don't pay that close of attention to it, to be honest, as I do to Queen's Park.
Well, the question I have, I just question whether or not, was he really a very good police chief, John? I mean, seriously, Mark Saunders?
let's give him his due in the sense that he did have some medical issues, and he ended up, you know, not showing up at a lot of things, and that'll be one of the issues. I mean, Mark Saunders is not a forthcoming guy, meaning that he can be honest, but he just doesn't talk a lot, and he's just not there. And when he showed up, I mean, the question was whether or not he was present. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, I mean, there are politicians. I look at the field right now, and I go back to what I said. I mean, Brad Bradford has got an exploration committee out there, and he may be a good choice for the Conservatives. Anna Bailao has got another group of people who are exploring. Josh Matlow's got friends of Josh Matlow who are exploring. Everybody's putting up their balloons, and there's even, Dave, I heard you discuss on News Talk 1010, you know, some people touting that, you know, just because former Mayor Miller had put some thoughts together this past week, that he might be putting his hat in the ring. I look back to after our podcast where I kind of ranted saying that we're $1 billion in the hole, and that's the biggest issue that an adult's got to deal with. Lo and behold, within 3 days, we have the deputy mayor sending a letter out. Maybe Jen McGelvey is listening up to all of this, but send it out, and it just kind of went into this nether sphere. So I come back to this and say, we're going to have, an interesting contest where, for the first time, I think, since the amalgamation of this city, when Mel Lastman was voted in, that we're going to have a clear view as to what kind of mayor we're going to have. We're going to be able to decide amongst a list of people on the ballots that do not have your city councillors to choose from, your mayors to choose from, your school trustees to choose from, all on one long sheet. You're going to get a list of people who are going to run this city, and you're going to get a period of time where there's going to be some scrutiny on what they stand for. So if you want to wheel out Mark Saunders against other politicians who are a little more savvy and a little more forthcoming and a little more backed by political muscle in this town, you know, you better be careful, because it may be that you don't get past, many hurdles. So I think we're not there yet, but I wonder, I say this again, I wonder why we haven't got somebody who's not associated with the local politics not stepping into the ring. These are one of these cases where you hear all the time in provincial and federal politics, let's get the business person, or let's get somebody who's outside, who's not contaminated. Let's, bring somebody in who's got more stature above it. And I don't know who that is, and maybe we won't get it, but it's just, it's kind of weird in this circumstance where we're dealing with people who have been around for a long time and just don't seem to have that stature to go ahead. look, Bonnie Crombie could go head to head with Doug Ford. She could go head to head with the Prime Minister for that matters. I mean, she has that stature to do that. We don't have this in the biggest city in the country. We don't have somebody who's at that level of look them in the eye and say, we're going to do this and we're going to get the money to pay the deficit down, blah, blah, blah. It just seems that we just don't have that, I don't know, maybe it's lightning in a bottle. We just don't have it at the moment.
Well, it's interesting. There's a piece in the Star this week from Sean McAuliffe, and he was talking about the quality of the candidates so far who are, exploring it. And he points to Brad Bradford and the list of people who are endorsing and supporting him. And he noted that the principals in some of the larger lobby firms like Navigator and Strategy Corp and Enterprise, they have all coalesced behind Brad Bradford. So These are the lobbyists who are running that campaign. These are the lobbyists and their interests that will be driving City Hall. It's an interesting part. They don't have to step out of the dark. They can actually put a candidate in there and drive it that way. It was an interesting premise.
And it's how it's done. We see this all the time now. It used to be that these political operatives or these consulting firms, they worked in the background very quietly. Now it's very public. They're very proud of this work. They go out and they're the commentators on TV all the time now. Not political journalists like myself. No, it's these consultants, these people that have been doing the backroom deals for years. So the fact that they have undue influence is well known. And let's face it, I mean, Mr. Bradford is being targeted quite heavily. I see a lot of attacks coming his way as well, alleging he's too close to the development community and this sort of thing. So this, I guess it's good to have the best spin doctors on your side.
But to be fair, I mean, they are political operatives, many of them who are very skilled at the game. And there's no off-season work for people who are in the political game other than to do exactly what they're doing. This is their trade. They are in the on season, they're running campaigns, and in the off season, they're doing lobbying and things like that. This has happened in the city where they basically coalesce behind somebody who's both a mixture of liberal and conservative versus someone who's from the left, and we've yet to see that person emerge so far. So we still have a ways to go.
All right. Well, that'll do it for us this week on the Ledge. Two things. I'm going to make sure I'll drop the Kathleen Wynne interview into this feed. So if you want to finish with this and then pop over and just check out the conversation I had with the former Premier of Ontario, and she touches on a whole bunch of things, including what Toronto needs in terms of its relationship with the province and with the federal government. All right. Thanks for joining us, Dave Trafford, for John Wright and Keith Leslie. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.